Hi, my name is Leon Botstein. I'm president of Bard College, and I'm a musician and a historian of music. My subject today are the arts and art, and what is it, and why should we study it? Why is it part of the university curriculum? Why is it something that an undergraduate student should worry about and spend time taking courses in? So the first thing is to sort of think about what the word means. Art is a word we use all the time. It is in ordinary usage, applied to lots of different things. And people get worried about, something, is it artistic? Is it art? What distinguishes art from anything else that you might encounter in the world? And probably the simplest way to say it is that art is something that transforms the everyday. It transfigures the ordinary. So, a good example, and a very sort of clear example, is in the period of pop art. The artist Andy Warhol took a Campbell soup can and made a work of art out of something we looked at ordinarily on the shelf of a supermarket. Take a photograph. Now you can take a photograph with your cell phone, you can look through it and snap someone's picture. The question is that art as opposed to a great photographic portrait? Take, for example, the great American photographer Edward Steichen. He did a portrait of Charlie Chaplin. You look at that portrait and you ask yourself, is that art or is it just a photograph of Charlie Chaplin? Well, there's something different about it. There's something unexpected. There's something that isn't quite in your ordinary experience, yet it's related to your ordinary experience. Another example comes also from the pop art era, and that has to do with comic books. So the great artist Roy Lichtenstein made big canvases where you had the same kind of visual impact that a comic book had. People with bubbles coming out of their mouths, with things being said, and things very much apropos of what comic books talked about: love, loss, a kind of soap opera story. So art is connected to what we experience every day, but it represents some kind of transformation of the everyday, something that is not actually entirely real. It can't be found by locating it. It requires human intervention. It is the fingerprint, if you will, of our existence in the world that has its impact on things we transform through the use of our imagination. It is always the case that there is some aspiration, some insight, something that happens in the transformation of the everyday through an artistic impulse that is entirely human and therefore subjective. There's something that goes beyond the thoughtless. It goes beyond something that we would pass by. It makes us stop and think about something quite important in an entirely different way. It's for that reason that, already from the Greeks, the notion that art making was human was crucial. It was something like love that only mortals could experience. Gods didn't make art, but we made art about the gods. Because our capacity was limited by our mortality, but yet our imagination, which was distinctly human, which was our own impression of the world with very limited knowledge and limited capacity, the way we escaped that limitation was through an imaginary world which we could create, the same way we escape our limitation of being mortal by imagining ourselves to be in love, and create a category we call love. So a good example would be to say music, which is perhaps one of the most easy aspects of art to talk about. Now, music doesn't exist really in nature. Birds sing, and there's bird song, and there's sounds in nature. But the system of Indian or Chinese or Western music, how we divide tones, how we organize them in the West by half steps and whole steps, sometimes with microtones, and we organize rhythm, and we create a grammar of sound and expectation. So a song like Row, Row, Row Your Boat is something that seems natural to us. We can identify when it starts and when it ends, We have a pretty good idea of how it's organized. Now that's totally artificial. There's no row your boat song out in nature. And there certainly isn't anything as complicated as, in the Western tradition, a Beethoven symphony. Or even an opera, which is very artificial, in which people are singing and talking and moving at the same time, saying different things, all within a coherent fabric. This is completely fictive. It doesn't have a real place in the world. Even when we try to be realistic, go to a museum and you look at a painting, a genre painting or historical painting, which depicts a scene that you think is really quite realistic. Someone is fighting a battle. A person is looking out a window. Or you're looking at a landscape, which you actually perhaps have seen yourself. But that frame is very artificial, and we allow ourselves to be caught up in the illusion of its realism. It isn't really out there, it isn't real, it's somebody's imagination of what is real. The perfect example is TV, video, and film, where we get caught up in a storyline that may take years and centuries. It seems real to us, the whole thing is only an hour and a half long, but it has the illusion of realism, and that is the artificial manipulation of our sensibilities through the work of an artist. All the transformations I've described, the creation of music or the creation of an artificial visual image, are things that people do regularly and things that don't always qualify as art. So we can choose people who design boxes or packaging for products, or people even do fashion design, although that's a contentious area. And people who write jingles or commercial music or soundtracks for TV shows. Now, is that art? Now, there's always a lot of debate, particularly among snobs, about what is art. People think they know what is art. And they confuse art with taste. It's hard to talk about. We are not sure what constitutes art. It's simply a matter of what I think is art, or someone else thinks is art. But it's quite clear that there's a continuum. Well, here we have a category of things we call artistic, or, very often a word that's used with art, the beautiful. Because we think conventionally that art is about the beautiful. And when we talk about beauty, people get very concerned about it because one person's beauty is another person's ugliness. There are people who think, well, you think it's art, but it means nothing to me. And then there's the notion that really great art is often misunderstood because it reaches beyond the conventional judgment of most of the people. So art often gets pegged at being something quite elitist. Most people don't think it's art. So for example, in abstract art, when people began to make paintings that seemed to be only one color, or very simple shapes, or Jackson Pollock did things with swirls of color that people thought, well, that I can do that, that's like finger painting. My child can do that. Well, there's something about a child's finger painting that may actually not qualify in our view as art, not because it's a prejudice, but because actually there's something different between a finger painting of a child and what Jackson Pollock does. One of the important things about what makes a work of art is the power of the human imagination to predict something. Although there have been strong traditions of art that are random, people who believe in randomness, or in happenstance, or in chance. Most of what we think is art is the result of people thinking about doing something and being carried away by either some plan or some intuition or some imagination. So the child's finger painting is probably distinguishable from Jackson Pollock by its structure, its composition, its intent, its design. Art is really the attempt to create through time and in space a work or a statement or an event that has some coherence, that derives from, is connected to all everyday experience, but is really quite apart from it, and works back in our experience of it to that everyday experience. It creates a vocabulary of sensibility, a vocabulary of interpretation, a vocabulary of meaning, that in one sense is beyond that of language. Very important about art is that it is not restricted to language. There is art in language. We see that in poetry, which is a different use of language. The use of language in many art forms, visual, architectural, and in music. But much of art, and much of the art that we care about, responds to something other than the linguistic. We talk about it in language, but our experience of it is somehow around language. It bypasses language. Many philosophers have argued that the visual, and particularly musical, reaches an individual in a different way, not through the medium of language, and therefore is not entirely rational, not something that we can say is right or wrong. When we say we're moved by a work of art, or that we're inspired by a work of art, we often find it hard to put that in words. The power of music, for example, is best expressed in the way music interacts with words. So take a great moment in the operatic literature, in Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. At the very end, it's an opera about infidelity. And at the very end, the Countess forgives her husband, the Count, for contemplating, if not realizing, infidelity. She realizes the loss of love. So as she forgives the Count, the music, which has no words to it, tells an inner story to the audience of a sense of loss, a sense of distance from what she's actually saying, that would be impossible to communicate without music. Much of art is public. Art hangs in museums. There are installations. There's public art. And the most important public art of all is architecture. What do buildings tell us about ourselves? If you look at a fabulous building, for example, the Helsinki railway station by Eliel Saarinen, fabulous building, massive, showing the public, the entire nation, the modern Finland, embodied by the train. So it's a massive train station, similar to many that is in Europe, but it has a slight difference. It speaks to its public by making it much lower and flatter. So the relationship of the individual to the massivity of the railway station is not imposing. It's not one of tyranny. It's not one of superior power. It doesn't celebrate industrial power. It doesn't celebrate wealth. And in fact, it is much more intimate despite its scale. Furthermore, through it, there are decorative elements which remind the user of an imaginary traditional Finland, of a Finland of the Kalevala, of a mythic past, of a tradition of a nation that was distinct from the rest of Europe. So local pride, folklore, national identity, all get communicated through art making, things that are completely artificial. You don't need to have that kind of railway station just to put trains in place. It could be a much more neutral, if you will, solution to how to build a railway station. The Capitol of the United States is an architectural statement that reveals ideals about what the builders thought the American Republic was going to be about. So art is a public endeavor, often, that takes place in public spaces. It's also a private endeavor. It informs how we organize our private space and how we use it. In days when people were amateur musicians and sang and played together, that was a form of a conversation. People sat down to play a string quartet, and that was a conversation with four people that used no language, just music. People sang together in their parlors. People went to choruses in church or in secular circumstances to sing together. So art is not only the enterprise of the individual art maker or the individual person who seeks to transform his or her experience of the everyday by something that is not real, but transformed by a human being called art. But they also have to recognize that art is about the way we live our lives in a public circumstance. When one recognizes that art is not merely an act of an individual who exceeds his or her boundaries of experience in ways we cannot predict, parenthetically, it's important to realize that art is never something that has to exist. In science, we have the notion that what we discover is something that somehow is out there. Now, that's not totally, entirely true. The way we describe it, our conception of nature and of the world and the laws of nature, affects how we understand it and use it. But there is a correspondence theory. There's some evidence. We have to show that the way we describe it, the theories that we have to describe it, actually are true. And there's some evidence. So there was a great deal of speculation and relief when relativity was proven by astronomical observation, by, so to speak, experimental evidence. Now, in art, what is created has no reason to exist. It wasn't out there before a human being made it, which is why art is so significant to the individual, because it is a reminder, both for the maker of the art and the person who engages with the art, of his or her uniqueness in the world. You know, we would like to think, which is true, that each of us has a fingerprint that is unique and a DNA sequence that's unique, which is why we can be identified if we commit a crime. But by the same token, the making of art is a reflection of that uniqueness which has no predictive content. When you hear a piece of music, a new piece of music written by a composer, or you see a work of art, an installation, performance art, a movie, any photography that one sees, one realizes this is the imagination of a single individual whose existence could not have been foretold. So there's a kind of uniqueness. That uniqueness has the parallel in the viewer. No artwork is complete unless it has someone who receives it. When there's no one in the museum, the real purpose of art dies. Those works come alive through the presence of a viewer. A piece of music exists only if it's played and heard, and therefore it requires human intervention. The important thing about that is that art is one way, particularly in our current society, to fight the sense of being superfluous. If one had to ask in contemporary life what is the most important aspect of art to the individual, is the recognition that in a very large mass society, in which most of the things we do are governed by efficiency, we can make things with robots, we actually produce food immensely efficiently, and with the promise of biotechnology and information science, it's likely that those efficiencies will only increase. So there are a lot of people in the world. What are we here for? We once thought the primary reason for our existence was labor. We were here because we had to. We had to till the soil. We had to protect ourselves from external danger, rain, snow, weather. We had to take care of the necessities of life. And by so doing, we had to do something useful. And that useful thing could be rewarded either in money, which was a much later system, or in actually goods, which would feed us and our children. But that notion of work and labor is increasingly at risk. While we would like to see all of our society very well employed, one could posit a future where we are not needed, where, there's an easy pass for every function. You don't need a toll collector anymore. You don't need an elevator operator. You don't need a manufacturing person. You don't need an artisan. So what are we here for? Well, we're probably here for the things that are not useful. We're here for the things that have no utility, that have no purpose, that are simply about our life. And that essential sense of our purpose being what we can do that may have no practical utility, that sense of the sacred character of our capacity to create, if one believes the Abrahamic tale that we were made in God's image, what does that mean? It means that God was a creator. He used language to create. Well, we also use language to create, but we also have the capacity for creation, for imagination. And the things that we imagine often fall into the category of art. Things that don't exist, things we put together, things we completely rely on our fantasy, our humor, our sense of joy, our sense of possibility, and our sense of the thing that wouldn't ordinarily occur if we just lived our lives in some predictive way, in some imitative way, which is why art can be dangerous, because it doesn't follow rules, rarely follows rules. But the important thing about art, both in its making and its absorption, its engagement, is we reinvent ourselves. We invent ourselves in our relationship to listening to music. In many circumstances, people who find their lives transformed by looking at a beautiful building, or a work of art, or even a movie, or young people who will swear by a series of popular songs that seem to be very meaningful to them. That identification with the imaginary, which helps us define ourselves in some unique way, the way we put it all together, the mosaic of our own tastes, those things allow us to give ourselves purpose where we could be very depressed by a sense of uselessness and boredom. The most terrifying thing is the loss of life and the sense of purpose by boredom. And that creates envy and hostility to others. We envy the person who seems to be useful and needed. We're looking for a safe place where we can feel ourselves important and significant, which is why many of us choose to join religious communities or other communities where through some community identification we give ourselves purpose. But art allows us as individuals to have a purpose as we make it, participate in it, consume it, if you will, engage with it. And it reminds us of not our capacity to create art, but to recognize it and follow someone else's imagination along with him or with her. Now, the social utility of art, the fact that it's public, the fact that it's pretty universal in the sense that most societies create some kind of system of it, the social utility has been a subject of enormous controversy. There are people who think precisely because art is imaginary in some way, it isn't real and it isn't useful in some way, is a kind of mirage that distorts our sense of value. Famously, Plato had his doubts about poetry and about certain kinds of art making. And there's a long tradition of suspicion that art, first of all, is a conceit among a very small group of human beings who try to make themselves superior through a kind of Ponzi scheme of values that they all inhabit and they exclude other people from. It's a Ponzi scheme because it really has no value at the end of the day. This notion of art is particularly prevalent in democratic societies, which is why, for example, in the United States, there is really no public subsidy of the arts. Because people will say, look, you think it's art, I don't think it's art, and these artists are not really useful, why should we support them? And art is really a matter of taste, so it's no different from clothes buying. You know, if classical music is so important, it should pay for itself. And people who like it should buy it. People like that painting on the wall and they want to pay $5 million for it. You know, I'm just as happy with a 10-cent poster I can buy down the street. Who's going to tell me that Norman Rockwell, the famous illustrator, is somehow inferior as an artist to some sort of strange thing that's on someone's wall in Southampton, who believes himself to be a real connoisseur and collector and has paid $4 million for something I wouldn't give 10 cents for. So in a democratic society, the majority wins, which means what we might think is art, perfectly reasonably, is Hollywood makes money, or Broadway on the off chance it makes money. And many of the non-commercial arts are considered, it's a conceit of a minority. It's one's own private religion. And that in mass society, in mass democracy, there's no agreement about what is art, and there's not real much agreement whether art is necessary in a society. Now that's totally seemingly persuasive. It actually is hypocritical because the government builds buildings, so it chooses architects, makes it absolute statement in what kind of architecture it chooses. But beyond that, the nation, in its military has orchestras and bands. It recognizes that art is part of the fabric of a community. It has always been part of the fabric of what we consider patriotism. The songs we sing, our national anthem. It's not so easy to say, well, there's no art. And there's also not so easy to say that, it's only those things that make money. Because in fact, all true things are not popular. Evolution is not popular, it may be true, but it isn't popular. And there are many facts which are not pleasant, but are true and hard to understand. The earth is not flat. We all operate as if it is. Now, it's very complicated to explain to someone that it's round, but the fact that that's true and it's only understood by a minority doesn't make it wrong. Now, the real debate in the arts is, are there criteria for art that could be persuasive in a democratic society to induce a society to support it? Is there some objective way of saying, well, a Beethoven symphony, a Wagner opera, a Debussy nocturne, those are superior to something else? That certain buildings, certain painters, certain sculptors are understood as critically superior to things that are of the same type but not as good? Is there a hierarchy of goodness? Is there some truth value to our judgments about art? Is it reasonable to say, well, that just isn't art, or is not very good art or bad art? If we could make those discriminations, then we might create a hierarchy of value where then we could justify society supporting it. In monarchies and aristocratic societies, arts were supported by patrons. And the patrons happened to be the state, in the case of kings and queens, emperors, and in certain eras, particularly the communist era, the party and the state had a very clear idea of what was art that was good for the state. Fascists had the same idea. Both Hitler and Stalin were art lovers, and they were music lovers, and they had very, very specific tastes. In Stalin's case, he hounded Shostakovich twice in his career, in the 30s and the 40s, for writing music that wasn't right, that wasn't really towards what art should do in the community. Now, those were not necessarily aesthetic criteria, they were political criteria, if you can separate the two for a moment. They were about what made people feel part of a working class, communist, proletarian nation. What kind of music should that sound like? What kind of painting should that be? Let's call it socialist realism. In fascism, it was a clear idea of how to portray the Aryan purity and the Aryan race and Nordic superiority. And music, like Carmina Burana, a very famous piece, that was designed to give people a sense of membership and solidarity, that manipulated people's emotions so it was consistent with the objectives of the state. But that's not about the truth value. That's about a regime's belief in how art actually can function to help that regime. So to return to the question, particularly for the United States, in a democratic society, we don't support the art because we can't agree as to what would be art. We can agree to what makes a profit. So if you want to do art and you can pay for it, everyone's happy, people can go to it. But why should we subsidize opera companies, museums, artists, performance spaces, independent filmmakers, and photographers? Why do that? Why not leave it simply to the marketplace? And one way to solve that problem would be to say, well, as in science, there can be a kind of peer review, an objective sense of what is good, what is bad, and if we could discriminate and could agree, then we could say, well, these people deserve support, these people don't. Clearly, the more you think about each separate art form, movies, films, buildings, music, painting, sculpture, performance art, you develop sensibilities, criteria. There was a great example, for example, in the case of the composer Mozart. He had a pupil, Thomas Attwood, who became a court composer in England during the reign of Victoria. He was a fine musician, but not a great talent. Perfectly fine craftsman, and wrote a fair amount of music, none of which has survived. But it's very competent. Now, his music is art music. It's fine, it's good, it's interesting, it's historically interesting, because every age has its own artistic currents. And it's very interesting to understand the past. Art is a terrific instrument for getting under the skin, so to speak, of a past era. Now, Thomas Attwood studied with Mozart. Now, Mozart was not much of a teacher. He did it only for the money. And the strange thing about Thomas Attwood is that it's the one complete record, because he was English and very meticulous, he kept his lessons with Mozart. It's the only record we have of Mozart teaching. He gave Attwood lessons and exercises. And it's a great example of a minuet dance in which he gave Attwood a bass line and asked him to fill it out. You got one line, you had to fill it out, to give melody. So he gave him a bass line, a kind of foundation which to write the minuet, which is a dance in 3 meter. And the fascinating thing is when Mozart was correcting it, he made slight changes. And if you play Attwood's exercise that he gave back to Mozart, and Mozart's, just to fill the time, just think about it, editing and changing of it, you see the difference between the ordinary and the great. And blindfold, an audience who's listened to a lot of 18th century minuets will identify the Mozart one right away. So there are many such examples where actually works of art and music catch an imagination or seem to appeal to some criteria of craftsmanship, perhaps even beauty, imagination, novelty, surprise. One of the things about art is that it breaks your expectations. Unlike a train ride where you would be shocked if there were a sudden stop, or if suddenly it turned upside down and kept moving. Right? Or as in all those Harry Potter films, you could levitate and go into an imaginary place with some wand. Well, art is like that to the human experience. It sets up expectations and then changes them. You think you're going down one road, you go to another. You think something's going to happen regularly, and then it just stops happening regularly. You think, well, it's going to look like this, and doesn't. It makes you look at the world around you in a different way. Well, the unexpected comes in varying degrees of sophistication. And so in every art form, there are criteria that have been developed that are both historical and go beyond historical periods, where we can discriminate from the more persuasive, the less persuasive, to some degree of agreement, and then it deviates, because the judgment of history isn't always right. We rediscover artists that we never thought much of and bring them back. A good example would be, for example, the Austrian painter Gustav Klimt. In the 50s was not an important figure, but by the year 2000 was a very important figure, even though he had died in 1918. There was a great Hungarian painter, Munkácsy, hugely patronized by Americans and by Europeans, a forgotten figure now, but in his lifetime, highly touted. The most expensive canvases to be sold before 1900 were by the Swiss-German painter Arnold Böcklin. After that, his importance almost vanished. He now is experiencing a revival. So tastes change and judgments change. And you cannot always rely on the so-called verdict of history, because there are many political and other factors that go into a person's success or failure. But there are areas of discussion where one can look at a novel, a poem, a painting, a building, a movie, and say, this is a great movie and that's why. And many of those things are separate from the content of the movie itself, or of the painting, or nominally the piece of music. These are things we call formal. And those are criteria of construction, the use of the materials, the use of space and time. They're criteria of the way conventions of storytelling or construction are used by the individual artist. So there are ways we can discriminate. At the very end, much of it is subjective, but there are many, many areas where great human achievements do require some more sophistication in the way we read, the way we look, and the way we listen. It can't all be naive. At first blush, a Mahler symphony doesn't seem comprehensible. How can one actually sustain one's attention over 75 minutes of just sound? But then, as one sort of listens to it and goes back and listens to a Beethoven symphony, and a Haydn symphony, and a Mozart symphony, and a Mendelssohn symphony, even a Sibelius symphony, a contemporary, you then get an idea of what the possibilities are. The first movie you see, well, you've never seen another movie. You see a lot of movies, you begin to discriminate, not only by the narrative or the subject matter, but by something about the form of the movie, the way movies are made or can be made or might be made. The same with photographs. Eventually, you can look at your own photograph that you took of your friend or your parents or your sibling with your camera in your cell phone and realize it isn't quite the same as a portrait by Irving Penn or Diane Arbus. There's something about what they did with the same basic medium that shows you that there's something you might learn, you might think about. You might be able to do it yourself. The question that we face increasingly is, to what extent in a democratic society, or in any society, particularly in what we might call open or free societies, should we encourage the development of the aesthetic sensibilities of our citizens? To what extent should art be encouraged as part of what we foster in the conduct of both private and public life? Is art a constructive constituent activity, art making, art viewing, art buying? Is the artistic conversation, if you will, an important part of what we would like to see in our society? Is it consistent with values such as freedom and justice? Now, these are, once again, topics that have a long history of philosophical and political debate. It's important to say that in unfree societies, in societies where there has been enormous amount of censorship and repression, art has usually been an avenue of dissent that is the place of last resort. Once speech, pamphleteering, public political activity was banned and restricted. The last refuge of freedom ended up being the arts, poetry, painting, particularly the arts that were not representational. They're a group of arts that are close or closer to nature. They might be painting, photography, film, which trade on the illusion of realism, and fiction, prose fiction. And then there are those that are less tied to nature, seemingly that's poetry, which doesn't really use language in the ordinary sense. And then there's music, clearly, which seems entirely abstract, the most abstract, perhaps, of the arts. And those become the most resistant to effective censorship. And therefore, art can be identified with courage and with breaking the habit to conform, especially if conformity is associated with tyranny. We simply go about our business while some people are harmed, killed, oppressed, exterminated. We are beaten into submission. And the resistance to that submission can often be the arts. By the same token, arts can serve the state, and they can be used to justify tyranny. Serge Prokofiev, the Russian composer who returned to live under Stalin, wrote a cantata for Stalin's birthday called Zdravitsa, for his health, whose text is unimaginable, praising Stalin for every good thing, even the rising of the sun and the health of children. Now, this fawning to one of the most evil people in recorded history doesn't make an advertisement for the virtue of the arts per se. The interesting thing about the arts, of course, is that while they may even be created to serve a particular political purpose, they are also susceptible to being reinvented. One of the best examples is, again, for music, is the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, which has a final movement, whose text is by the German poet Schiller, and it's nominally about human brotherhood and so-called the Ode to Joy. But it was performed on a regular basis by the Nazis to celebrate Hitler's birthday and to celebrate the heroes of the 1941 attack on Russia. And it was also used to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall. Two completely opposite political purposes using the same music. It resists appropriation, partly because music has never been useful, and therefore to be taken into a purpose that's useful, since it's useless by definition, it never quite fits. It doesn't fit as a constituent element in somebody's scheme entirely persuasively. But the question in a free society, or one where highly fluid in terms of what we individuals can do, especially a consumer society, where we, in a way, like to think of our freedom mostly as freedom of movement, where we can go and what we can do using money as a metaphor of movement. So there was a great American artist, Barbara Kruger, who had a painting with sort of a spoof on the Cartesian phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Instead, she had, "I shop, therefore I am." In other words, the idea that our self-identity is as consumers. Is art a useful instrument of criticism, constructive criticism, to the conceits of our society? Now, that's a hard thing, because much of art in the United States, in our societies, is patronized by very wealthy individuals. So it's odd to see very wealthy individuals collect or support art that has huge amounts of social criticism. So people living in big houses and mansions buy art that somehow utilizes the suffering of others or tries to point out injustice, social injustice. There's something slightly hypocritical about these uses of art, and artists who, in visual arts, make a lot of money trading on a kind of sympathy of the very wealthy and powerful for the plight of the poor and underserved, but really do nothing about it. People go to a play that shows the suffering of an Afro-American man, and they feel ennobled by having wept in the theater at the sight of the suffering portrayed on the stage. And they think they've done something to advance that cause. There's not a lot of evidence that that's true. Not a lot of evidence that, except for making myself feel more noble, because my sympathies were in an artificial context on stage or in a movie with a protagonist who was somehow disadvantaged while I was very comfortable and advantaged in some way, that emotional identification through art is constructive. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that that actually is the very opposite, that all art does is allow us to be more complacent with injustice. Art prettifies, in some aesthetic way, all the evils of human society. Artists are really the worst servants of the state because they dress up all that's bad in the world in a way that makes it palatable. And in fact, the conceit of my being superior by being an artist allows me literally to pull the shades in my window as I see the injustice in the street. It allows me to exempt myself from a sense of social responsibility because I'm superior. And there comes the whole conceit of the artist, the bohemian, the person who doesn't play by the rules, who thinks she or he is superior because they're artists. And therefore they're exempt from having to do what we all have to do, which is somehow contribute to the world around us and make the world better in some constructive way. So it's not clear that just generically art is constructive, that art is always about freedom, always about individuality. It's always on the right side, not clearly so. And that the values that it puts forward are not always ones which we would find totally defensible. But the important thing is to think about the question as an activity and as a repository of human achievement. Is this something that needs to be fought for? And at the core of that question is there a relationship between what art does and the good? Morally good, ethically good. Is there a connection, as the 18th century philosophers would have liked to think was the case, between the good and the beautiful? The Russian writer Leo Tolstoy really said beauty isn't the issue, that in fact beauty is the problem. Art shouldn't be about beauty. Art really should be about community and about goodness. And the function of art is precisely to use the imagination to remind us that we are all the same as children of God. In his case, a Christian God and a Christian world. But the fact is that he was suspicious of individuality, although he was himself supremely an individual in the individualistic sense. And he was very suspicious of art short of some moral, ethical purpose, teaching of morality. It was kind of an instrument of religion. And he was very suspicious, and he was in a long line of thinkers who held art in suspicion because it separated some human beings from others. It was against the notion that we're all created equal, that we're all the same people. Now, I happen to think the argument is very powerful, but requires an answer. I'm not sure they have the answer. Art has some relationship to what is good. One thinks about that. It also has some relationship to what might be true. Art isn't completely arbitrary because it comes out of the human imagination and becomes something that we then need to respond to. There are things about it which seem to be susceptible to creating a conversation among human beings that advances the cause of what is good and what might be true. To give an example. In the performing arts, the great thing about the performing arts is that there's no object. There's no residue. You know, a painting or a photograph or a movie can be reproduced. It never really gets lost. Now, the original might get lost, but there are pictures of it. And if you preserve it, it can last forever. So we can go to museums and look at artworks that were made thousands of years ago. But the important thing is that where the truth and goodness comes in is that in the performing arts, it is only there when it is performed and then in the memory of the people who've performed and listened. So the performing arts cannot be standardized. We now live at the end of the age of recording. The great thing about the internet is that it has destroyed high-fidelity recording. People who used to buy records and listen to them. Now, we can listen to these records, but the MP3 file or the digital file that we now use doesn't sound particularly good, but it's sufficient for us when we're running or we're sitting around. But we realize when we go to a real live concert, whatever form of music it is, there's a kind of visceral, acoustic sensuality. And we realize something that was always true, that the work of music or the work of theater is in its presence. Seeing that actor up there, seeing how she speaks, seeing her perspire, seeing her act. And every night is different. The performance exists not on tape, it exists only in the viewer's reading of that performance. And no two viewers' reading of that performance is alike. Therefore, the arts have a fundamental function in redeeming the sanctity of every single human being. And since we believe that the sanctity of every single human being is actually a true belief, and we think it's the right belief, that my recognition, whether I'm on stage or I'm in the audience, that in this specific time and this specific place, in some village, in some city, outdoors, indoors, day or night, that musical performance, that theatrical performance, that form of performance art, that concert, was a moment in time that can never be recaptured. Since time moves in one direction. And that it becomes a constituent element of my memory. The sense of the commonality of that human experience is quite significant because it transcends the most ordinary. The experience and fear of birth and death, the fear of hunger, the fear of pain. While we might think that that would be sufficient to make us feel common with other human beings, the more sophisticated our society becomes, the more literate we become, the more instruments of differentiation we accumulate, the more important things like art are to recognize our interdependence and our equality. So I would argue that an aesthetic sensibility deepens the sanctity of life. And insofar as you deepen the sanctity of life, you create some potential of resistance against violence and cruelty and against tyranny. Now, that's very optimistic and very religious of me, if you will, and it's not something that I can defend entirely by evidence. A good historian would demolish my argument by saying, all the Nazis were music lovers, the communist elite were art lovers, every second two-bit dictator has been some kind of art collector, and even amateur artist. But I would say to that, that doesn't disprove the possibility. It does prove that making of art is the reflection of an exceptional amount of ambition and courage. People who are artists are more likely than not people with more of a drive than is probably healthy. Most artists are, in that sense, slightly deviant. The sane people are always in the audience. They're not the people that made the pictures in the museum, they're people who go to the museum. And I have greater respect for the audience than I have for my fellow artists in terms of sanity and perhaps even human kindness. But the activity itself and the recognition that we're capable of it has some kind of uncomfortable, potential, not yet realized relationship to what we might think is both true and good. The 18th century philosophers were not off the mark. Our capacity to create something that is not useful, that's only understood by mortals, that's only within the human experience, and that is beyond the provable and everyday, that's unpredictable, That is the highest praise we can give for being human. Therefore, the historical residue in all cultures and histories of that impetus and that impulse seems worthy of study. And it is deeply encouraging to our sense of our own lives to look at the works of the imagination in all their forms, whether it be the visual, the spatial, the decorative, the useful, the auditory, or even the physical in terms of dance and movement. It was said, and I think plausibly so, that in the organization of his ideas and in the presentation of his ideas, Einstein, in the early part of his career, was deeply influenced by his musical sensibilities. He was a mediocre violinist, not a very good one. The school records we have are not particularly complimentary, and he really never played very well. And his tastes were very limited, but he really loved the classical tradition, which was really Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. And he liked really early and mid-Beethoven, not the more experimental late Beethoven. But it could be argued that his notion of beauty and elegance in scientific explanation had a lot to do with a sense of proportion, clarity, transparency, and logic that was enhanced by his musical sensibilities. And so looking at the history of art and art making, and then looking at what we in our time would do as artists to put ourselves in the imagination of the artist is, I think, very good use of a student's time. My recommendation for students would be not to be passive, not to take only art history or music history or theater history or dance history, but actually to do it. The most important thing about art is the capacity of each human being to make it. So if you're interested in music, don't just study it, do it. Sing, play. If you're interested in movement, do dance and movement. If you're interested in the visual arts, make visual art. If you're interested in performance art, do it. Want to make movies? Make movies. Take photographs, but in a more sophisticated and more disciplined way than with your iPhone and cell phone. It is the cultivation of the ability to organize the world in this way which will help you in other ways. The hidden secret of the arts is that they have collateral utility. So for example, a student who learns how to abstract an image in a drawing class, take a figure seated, draw that figure, but make sure the figure's boundaries touch all four sides of the page. A very hard assignment. But the analytical capacity to manipulate one's sight and one's capacity for abstraction is hugely powerful as a skill in life. To the ability to write a canon or a song, the ability to play an instrument, to sing, to dance. These are disciplines of body and mind which have unexpected utility in whatever one wishes to do. It would be a tragedy to go through a university life without a deep engagement with the arts. It's one of the few things in a university that, in a student's experience, that has a lasting impact on the conduct of adult life long after one graduates. So I encourage you and I thank you for your time and for your interest.